This is an interview of Peter MacGill by Jonathan Machen after the remodel of the Solstice Center in Boulder, Colorado was completed. It goes into more depth of the metaphysical elements of the project than the main documentary, and that includes connecting the building to nature and the surrounding area, sacred geometry, electromagnetic mitigation, and spiritual enhancement. Time's flying.
10th of June, 2009. Here we are in the Lotus Room.
Lotus Room. And
Okay.
it's wonderful being here. I always like coming back to projects that I've done because I get to feel them. There's no responsibility. There's no everything going on. I can just sit and look around and go, yeah, I remember that. And I can enjoy it.
Yeah,
So
the memory of all that chaos now is just a distant figment. The dust blowing around, all the insulation, the wisecracks of Rob, and now it's kind of peaceful and silent in here.
it was a challenging project, and it was fairly complex because of all that went in here. It's a 100-year-old building, so we did run into some structural problems that we had to field. And of course we had it engineered, and there were some electrical problems and some spatial problems with the mechanical systems, so it all had to be worked out. Even though we had plans to begin with, we still had to work out a lot of things, and there was a lot of discovery as we went on, which was some seat-of-the-pants decisions and some re-engineering and things like that. And then there was the ever-present conflict between historical preservation and energy conservation and zoning. And it'd be nice if those groups could have some communication with each other and work out their differences so that it could be a more efficient process for building in the city of Boulder.
Well, considering the building department, I had a question about that. What if Vardon had decided to just start from scratch? Would there have been as many challenges in getting, what he wanted if he had just rebuilt from scratch as opposed to remodeling this place?
Remodeling was complex. If we had scraped this over, the new construction seems simpler to me.
Simpler. So, but I'm wondering though if redoing the building as it was, as it stood, with all its challenges, had some benefits. Were there any benefits to doing that?
I think in terms of historical preservation, yes, there was. And by bringing this building up to current standards in terms of energy conservation and that kind of challenge to show that it can happen was a benefit.
Yeah, I can see that.
So, and there is some energy in this building that's old and could just stay here,
Well, that's an interesting question. All the workshops and the Rolfing and the meditations, if the building had been scraped and a new one put up, I assume you'd be losing a lot of that, in a sense, the feel of the space. Because a lot of people come in here and they really enjoy how it feels. And
yes,
my feeling is that perhaps that feeling is amplified now that the building is really up to snuff and redone in a really beautiful way, perhaps.
for more reasons than just beauty or bringing it up to modern standards, and that's part of what we'll be talking about here today.
Okay.
Another thing that helped, make this project successful was the crew that we had. It's a wonderful crew and a wonderful bunch of subcontractors that came in here, and that made it worthwhile to have responsible people and good energy people to help build. And then, of course, Ben, the owner, is great to work with. So that made the project work out well.
Well, that's fortunate, and from my point of view, it was also a really exciting project, being the building manager and having all these folks coming in, completely tearing apart the space while we're trying to rent the building in different parts that aren't being remodeled was very exciting and a little challenging. Well, let's talk about the green technology. Everyone's talking about green building technologies, and what specifically happened here that made this building fall into that category?
Well, the biggest thing is that we added solar panels on the roof and a large hot water storage tank in the basement and radiant floor heating in most of the building. By using solar, we can produce 40 to 50% of the heat for the building, and that's a huge savings. And talk about carbon footprint, you know, we really reduced the impact of this building, you know, on the surrounding area, town and stuff like that. There were many things that we did, including, you know, recycling and reusing material to low VOC paints, the kind of adhesives we used, the carpets, sustainably harvested lumber, that kind of thing. There was a pretty long list that we applied to the building. So,
like the deck upstairs, that's what kind of wood? It's not real
well,
wood, isn't it?
it's recycled plastic, you know,
Right.
so that wasn't a wooden deck that had to cut trees down.
Yeah.
And we added, you know, much more efficient backup systems, HVAC systems, and swamp coolers and things like that. So the overall, the building, and including a very efficient insulation envelope for this part of the building. So that's why it's so quiet, and it'll be thermally much more efficient. So it'll be easier to heat.
Well, the big room also got insulation too on the roof. Is that right? It got.
We added insulation
It was
on
a couple
top,
inches.
so that's going to be more efficient too.
Yeah. So everywhere in this space, it's becoming tighter, more energy efficient.
But I wanted to mention that we did add passive solar upstairs with some concrete right inside of these south-facing windows. So you have a solar mass that's incorporated into even a separate zone of radiant floor heating. So you have a overlapping system that will help to heat the building, and some of that is basically free by, you know, absorbing solar energy during the day and emanating at night. So that particular thermostat may not come on, or come on much later than it normally would have.
Well, we're already seeing drops in our energy bill, which I'm happy to announce.
Sure.
Which is great.
And we also thought into the future and constructed things in a way that could adapt to future technology. That was thought through so that as much as we could know or much as we could build in that way, if the technology of solar panels change, or if we include PV panels later on, the building is ready for that. Conduits for Ethernet cables or whatever, you know, that's easier to wire into the building. So
Are you saying you could get like the solar panels, the not the solar thermal, but the solar electric panels in? So there's room for the building to grow, is what you're saying, with
in terms
like
of the
that.
wiring system in the building could
Okay.
handle PV panels, like photovoltaic panels.
Okay. So there was a lot of green building techniques that went into this, but what about some of the less known aspects of remodeling about this building do you want to mention?
Sure, there were a variety of them, from sense of place to sacred architecture, sacred geometry, to EMF mitigation. And so just to begin with, in terms of a sense of place, a lot of people are attracted to this area and may not know why, but they're drawn here and they like it here for some reason. Just to talk about this particular area in this part of town, you know, we have a stream coming out of a canyon and spreading out into the plains, and there's a lot of natural energy here. The Native Americans use this as a transition place because they recognize that land has different energy in different places. The plains energy where they were out in the winter has a different feel to it than the mountains, is where they were in the summer. So they came into this area and they did ritual and they allowed one to be released and the other to be embodied, you know, and to move up into the mountains. So to them, this was sacred ground.
It's a transition spot almost.
It's a transition spot.
Where they were holding the memory of both places in them and then moving on, and this being a common spot. That serves today, it seems, because people have done Rolfing workshops here, and years later they come back and they're, you know, here's the building, and so I can see how that would be.
But there was some pretty rapid encroachment by white man into this area, and there was some discourse that happened between the two cultures, and that energy had to be worked with, released, in order to have the natural background of nature and the land be in this building. So
what about that balance? Tell me about, where do you see the balance of that in this building now? especially considering what has happened here with the remodeling.
Well, one of the ways that we establish balance in the building is through sacred architecture and sacred geometry. The way that nature manifests itself is in right proportion, meaning that flowers, trees, pine cones, shells all grow in proportion, a right proportion that makes it functional and efficient. And so we took those principles that are contained in sacred geometry and sacred architecture, and we brought them in. We started with an existing building, a shell, and we had to keep that, so we couldn't change the size, dimensions of a room. So we used architectural features to instill those features.
Give us an example of one of those places.
One of them is the display cabinet in the foyer that is the sacred rectangle. When you look at that, you may find it pleasing. It may not be a conscious recognition, but your body registers something that's in balance or harmonious. But the bigger example might be the skylight box in the foyer. The opening in the roof is in right proportion to the room that's below it, so that there is a larger scale of a proportion that is in the building that's balancing and harmonious. So when people come in to that room and are preparing to go into these adjoining rooms to do healing, yoga, meditation, or whatever, they're actually preparing in a balancing and harmonious environment. And so that's very healthy.
Well, we're lucky we had a chance to modify at least that part of the building, and
Yes.
that sees so many people coming through. I think it was really a great spot to have that happen.
One must be very creative in the application of this stuff, because some things you can't change, but some you can, and you really have to look around to see where you can put something in that will have an effect.
Right. So that's one principle that you added, I see. And what about some of the other not so visual aspects of what changed here?
Some of them are the EMFs that we worked with. They're in the non-physical realm.
What's the EMF?
The EMF is a electromagnetic field or frequency.
Okay.
There's a natural background radiation from the earth, a whole array of radiation that humans have evolved with, and that has been in balance for a long time. Technology has taken those particular bandwidths, and isolated them and amplified them in the use of electricity, Wi-Fi, cell phones,
Which we have
satellite.
here.
Sure.
Yeah.
And it's ever present everywhere. And so you may not be able to alleviate that because you really can't, but you can reduce it. So there were wiring protocols that we used throughout the building that helped reduce the magnetic fields in the human environment.
And there were quite a few wires exposed everywhere, weren't there? I remember seeing masses of hot wire in this space.
Yes.
And then tell us about the skylight room, the wire that was going through there.
Well, the biggest example of that mitigation was there was a sub-panel wire that ran under this room right over here, the skylight room, and it was less than a foot away from people who were sitting on the floor doing healing work.
Kids were singing too.
Sure.
And, yeah.
And it had not a real high magnetic field, but it was well into the room. And so we had that moved up to the roof of the building to be able to get to where it needed to go.
It was sort of an extra expense, wasn't it? I mean,
Quite a bit.
yeah.
And then the story goes, there was a shaman woman who wanted to do a workshop in the skylight room, and she came in there before the wire had been moved and said, something doesn't feel right here, and didn't rent the room. And then a year later, she came back, and you were the person that I guess
I can vouch for this.
Yes,
Yeah.
and she said, something's changed, and this feels good in here now.
Yeah, it was
And
really
she
remarkable.
went ahead and rented the room.
Yeah.
So, what it shows us is that we can consciously or unconsciously feel the effect of magnetic fields. But the thing that's more important is that those fields can affect us, and we either know it or we don't know it. For the most part, we don't know it. Well, even though if you can't sense it, you can measure it.
Right.
Not all can you measure, but with a gauge meter you can measure fields and find wiring problems or just find things that need to be mitigated, whatever.
Well, we're doing more meditation here too, and I suppose when you're in that state of mind, your brain frequency is is changing, and it's a subtle thing, and a good space is important for that. So I think,
Well, that's the point. They've been able to associate certain brain waves with certain dimensional realities, and EMFs can interfere with those brain functions, especially in healing or meditation, but also in just thinking clearly.
yeah,
So-
that's fascinating.
Overall, we worked with the energy of the building by bringing in natural elements, and as people use the building and they recognize if you want to call it the intelligence that helps to create the form of the building and is held within the building, natural intelligence that's equal to that of humans. It's just different. It's harder to verbalize it, or it's harder to quite describe it, because it is very different than what we consider to be our reality. The more you recognize that in the building, the more you allow it to exist in the building. The more you do ritual in the building, the more you create a sacred place. So there's different ways of creating sacred space, but one is by human use. Some of them occur naturally, and then some of them occur by both of those together, by recognizing a natural place that has power in it and by using it in a ritualistic manner. So we're able to instill sacred space in a building, and where it actually promotes human health and well-being by doing all these different elements that we put in here, especially for the purposes this building is used for.
So it's almost like taking architecture beyond its traditional function of being, a space, and that of course is the base, a place for shelter and refuge and nourishment. But then you're also talking about more than just that physical basic need. It's sort of a psychological and spiritual evolution. And my question about that is, does everybody need this kind of remodeling or rebuilding? Or it seems like it would benefit people to have a space renovated according to some of these principles regardless.
I think that there's a lot of different kinds of people, and not all people are sensitive to this kind of thing. I think the effect would help many people. I don't want to put a percentage on it, but I think many people would benefit out of a building that holds a higher vibrational energy, if you want to call it that, that is cleaner, greener, and more supporting for human existence. Some architecture just doesn't hold that kind of energy. It's more dense, or it bleeds energy out of the building.
Well, tell me a little about what you know about the green movement in Boulder, and what other people are doing in this town or country that's similar, or...
Well, it makes me wonder what the basis of the green movement is. I see a lot of products, being sold in the green movement, to make money, basically, and then of course that helps the economy.
Yeah.
So that's one idea of the green movement. Another green movement is to reduce our carbon footprint, which helps global warming,
Right.
slows down global warming. But is that really changing the way we live? Maybe a little,
Maybe a little.
a lot. But
Right.
I think one of the biggest things is what is our relationship to the earth and to nature? And to me, that may be the bottom line of the green movement, but that's not something that is discussed publicly or defined. What really is nature, and what is our relationship to the earth?
Well, we're getting closer, aren't we? I mean,
We're getting closer.
We're starting to think about, what is our energy impact, carbon impact.
The last book called The Last Child in the Woods, describes nature deficit disorder is a real disorder, and I think that it's fairly widespread in the Western world, and it has been the cause of the environmental destruction that's happened to the earth. It's a disconnection, to cycles that happen in nature, and to the earth, to the lands, the energies of lands, and to respect.
Yeah.
And there's no relationship there. It has allowed for destruction to happen. So when you create a building that has nature's energy in it, whether in architecture or in some other way, through acknowledgement, you're actually creating a healthy, sustaining environment. Part of the green movement that may not be talked about either is the a building like this actually sustains the people that live in it. So we're talking about the spiritual side of people, or the well-being side of people. So we get so lost in, oh, I got solar panels, or I used low VOC paint, but how does one feel being in the house using those products?
Yeah.
So that's a little bit harder to define. It's very personal, but it's a very important element of it. Well, the thing I asked at the open house was how many people in the audience were aware of how the building felt when they walked in. And most people raised their hand. So that may be, this is Boulder.
Yeah.
People are much more aware of Boulder.
Yeah.
We're not that aware of how the buildings we live in and work in affect us. You, in terms of wearing skins, our physical body is our first skin, and that's where most of the attention goes. It's taking care of the physical body, and of course in Boulder it's mind, body, spirit. It's still focused within the first skin.
I thought it was Gore-Tex first, and then body, spirit. Sorry.
The second skin is the clothes we wear.
Right, okay.
In Boulder it's, Gore-Tex and Crocs.
Okay, back seriously
many
though.
things. But anyway, the third skin is the buildings we work in. That is actually an environment that envelops us and kind of separates us from the larger world. And that's, we wear that, and it affects us.
A lot of people wear this building.
So that's what we're starting to define here, and to help people even begin to have the awareness of what that third skin is. That a building can affect you and what you do in it. And then the fourth skin would be the area you live in. I think a lot of people here are somewhat aware of that, but when you can bring the awareness of the area you live in into your building, then that becomes even more nourishing. In the larger context, we live near a power spot in Rocky Mountain National Park, and that's a whole different topic.
Yeah.
That does emanate a lot of power, and we live in proximity to that. It affects the whole Front Range and the surrounding area, so that things that happen in here, in this even smaller area, have a relationship to that. So in sense of place, we're looking at how we relate to our immediate environment right around in our neighborhood, but also to the Front Range and to the even larger area around, because we're a part of that. When people do bring in 4 directions, that's a kind of exercise and ritual that helps a person feel his place in a much larger world, standing on this earth and being in this universe, which we get so involved in our schedules and talking on our cell phone and doing everything that we lose sense of where we are. Do we look up and see the sun coming up and the seasons change and the clouds and the rain, and smell the flowers, and are aware of how this land feels as we're walking on it? We've kind of lost some of that.
Is it possible to bring that awareness into any building you might be working on or remodeling? How does one approach that topic?
I believe we can bring it into any building. How we would do it would depend on the building and the people who use the building. Intention is really important. What the building owners or the building users want to create in that building varies from building to building, especially among commercial buildings.
Yeah.
So you have to really define what that is, and then what kind of elements would manifest that intention. And so that would help to define the kind of elements that you would build in architecturally or however. So that's always the creative element of it. But that's very specific, because nature responds to humans unconditionally.
Yeah.
So how you install that kind of energy in the building is relative to what they want.
Yeah, it's a whole other topic, isn't it? Just
It's a whole,
redesigning based
it's a
on
huge
some
topic. And some of that's discussed on a website, www.weeness.org.
Weeness,
NESS.org, talks about human relationship to nature and what that actually is in some depth.
Okay.
So that's one area to learn.
That's neat. Weeness.org.
I think what needs to happen here is kind of a redefining what nature is. Instead of a scientific definition of inanimate objects sitting out there, we need to talk about nature as actually an intelligence. and like I said before, equal to that of humans, just different. Nature is what's responsible for holding all that we see, visible and non-visible, in form. And so there has to be an intelligence there to do that. And I'm not talking about intelligent design, that's something else.
Mm-hmm.
I'm talking about what's actually there. It's behind the scenes, to hold the blueprint for form, together. So I think there needs to be a resurgence of some of the very older views, but in a modern way of what nature is. All religions, go back into more earth-based activities and rituals and things like that, and recognition, and it's changed through time, through religion and philosophy and stuff. So we need a modernization of that relationship and a redefinition of what nature really is as something to be worked with, to co-create with, because that's how it happens, whether we have good intentions or not. Nature will co-create with us in that. So
yeah, I guess we're equal partners, but as partners with nature, humans seem to have taken some pretty poor steps as far as the environment and
yes,
balance of life, the fabric of life. We're really stressing nature out.
well, I call that lack of communication or relationship to nature that allows people to do that.
Yeah.